Hey everybody, how are you today? So today we're going to talk about the 9 different causes of the Great Depression. Last time we talked a little bit about what the United States economy was like during the 1920s and how eventually in October of 1929 there were major events that transpired on Black Thursday and then again on Black Tuesday, which eventually led to the stock market crash. Many people think that the stock market crash led to the Great Depression, but that's just not true. And so, what we're going to talk today about are the different factors that were happening in the United States in the years prior to the Great Depression that really lead to the Great Depression. So, if you don't have your notebooks out yet, you're going to want to take those out. So, when the stock market crashes, it's going to have huge reverberating effects, which we're going to get to. But we're also going to be talking about some of the other factors happening in the United States before the crash, which really lead to the Depression. During the Great Depression, pictures such as this are going to become very commonplace. A car such as this was worth more than $100, but this man, who's dressed reasonably well, looks pretty formal in this current era, but back then this was pretty much normal attire for a man to go out and about in. He would always be wearing a hat and such. And a man who was of the middle or upper classes would most likely be dressed in a suit. But you see, he's willing to sell his car, which is worth more than $100, because he's desperate. He's lost everything he owns and all of his money, perhaps, on the stock market, and he needs food. He needs lodging. And so scenes like this, which are rather depressing, are going to become rather commonplace during this era. So let's get into the major causes of the Depression. So as we get into these notes on the major causes of the Depression, remember these are your notes. Feel free to write down as little or as much as you'd like. So the first thing that we need to mention is that in the 1920s, it became rather obvious that wealth was not evenly divided among Americans. We know that in the years after World War I, there was an economic slowdown during the period of demobilization, where, a lot of women lost their jobs because men who were coming home from the war really wanted them. We also know many African Americans felt persecuted by returning soldiers, and so they kind of were forced to leave in some cases. We know there were race riots and tensions. We know that there were massive layoffs as companies were no longer producing guns and bullets and things like that. Some women chose to become housewives and to get married to their fiancés who'd been away at the war. Other women were very depressed, right, because their boyfriends, husbands had died during the war effort, and so they were going to continue working. So for a while, there was unemployment, there was an economic slowdown, a recession. Remember, that's part of the normal business cycle. There's ups and there's downs. Recession is an economic slowdown with high unemployment. If it turns into unemployment of more than 12%, you've got that depression. But as we get into the mid into the late 1920s, we really see that the Republican government led by President Harding, and then he dies and President Coolidge comes into office, they're all about laissez-faire capitalism, let it be, a government with few restrictions. It's all about how can you make money. It's all about profit. And so new products are coming out. There's lots of advertising, and Americans are able to buy these new products, whether it's a new toaster or refrigerator, on installment plans. So buy now, pay later. And during this time period, it becomes very clear that the rich Americans become even richer. Many of them, who have money because they own land, they, had money from their family's history, perhaps they're an inventor, and they open up a new business. They take their money and they invest in the stock market. So by the time we get to the mid-1920s, about 5% of Americans held 33% of the wealth in America, which is crazy to think about. And they continue to play the stock market. And it is a bull market, meaning the market continues to go up. It's not a bear market where the market goes down. They're very interested in stock speculation, where they're trying to play the market to make money, and they're buying when it's low and they're trying to sell that stock when it's high to make as much money as possible. When the stock market crashes, it's going to have a major impact on the wealthy, not on the average American. And these people, of course, they will sell their stock. Many of them end up selling the stock at a lower price than they paid for it, so they lose money. And they, really kind of are going to feel it in their pocketbooks. Perhaps they even have to pay back money to someone else because many of them had bought stock on the margins. They're playing the stock market with money that wasn't technically theirs. They're going to have to go to the bank to basically, take out money to pay their bills and pay off debts. They're also going to have less confidence. And since they might not have money to expand their businesses like they once thought, because many of these people were business owners, or they're not going to, perhaps they were going to renovate their home because they're very wealthy. They put those plans on hold. Maybe they're going to expand their business or open up a second restaurant. All of those plans go on hold because they've just lost money in the stock market. And so this is where we get into a domino effect. If you don't have the money to open up a second restaurant or open up another factory or build a new home, it means that those potential jobs that you were going to, have people working for you or employing people, those people will now be getting laid off. And so that's how the stock market comes to affect the average American. In general, the average American really isn't affected by the stock market crash because they didn't play the market. They didn't know a whole lot about it. As you played the stock market game, you probably realize it's difficult to play the market and make money. Some of you might not have lost all of your savings if you didn't get to the actual crash. And it really just depended on your own individual luck. But really and truly, the average American wasn't truly impacted by the crash. It's more so that their boss may have been impacted, especially if they worked for a large company like a John Deere, and they might have faced layoffs. As they were laid off, they didn't have any money in their savings account to help pay their bills, and that's where the trouble is really going to come from. Now, also when we're talking about the economy of the 1920s here, we have to pay attention to the fact that, a lot of people think of the 20s and they think, if I could go back in time, the 1920s, that seems like a rip-roaring era. They even call it the Roaring 20s. There's fun slang. There's people who are drinking and dancing and partying, and it seems like this happy little time. But you have to remember, they are drinking in excess, even though it's illegal, and they are violating the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol. They're drinking illegally in these speakeasies. You've got legends like Al Capone, who's a bootlegger who's selling liquor in Chicago and making a fortune, from it. People are drinking desperately because they're depressed. They're trying to forget the amount of Americans that died in World War I, the fact that an entire generation of men has become lost. So it's not as happy-go-lucky as you think. And people are also buying goods to try to make themselves feel less depressed. And so they can kind of keep up with their neighbors. They're really kind of buying into these advertisements, which are being put out on the radio, which now everyone has. Most people during the war bought themselves radios. And a lot of people during the war rationed their money. They didn't spend their money. There wasn't a whole lot of goods to buy. It was all just wartime goods in a wartime economy. So now they have money. There's no rationing. And they're going to buy all these new consumer products that are coming out. But I alluded to this the other day. Let's say that Black & Decker is making toasters. They're making toasters. They're making them great. And so everybody's buying one in America. The price of Black & Decker stock is going up to reflect all these profits. We have an increased, as a nation, gross domestic product and gross national product. So in terms of the amount of wealth we're making and goods we're producing. Now here's the problem. Eventually, you hit what we call overproduction. There are more toasters available than there are consumers. Toasters last for many, many years. My husband and I have had the same toaster, I think, since like 2003. Okay, so they don't go bad, is what I'm getting at, a lot of them. They're not like, made just to fall apart the next day. So eventually we have more toasters than we really have people to buy them. And they're going to be looking to Europe to try to sell their products overseas, but unfortunately Europe is still going to be struggling from the Great Depression. The other issue is overproduction for farmers. And the 1920s was a really difficult era. We see that, yes, there were strides for women, right? As women became flappers and they were dancing and trying to kind of have more of a sexual revolution. They're getting the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. But it was also very difficult for African Americans, right? We see intense racism as there's fights over jobs, right? As African Americans were treated as heroes over in France for doing their part in the war effort. And then they came home and they were treated yet again as nothing under Jim Crow laws that segregated races. So there were real problems. And farmers are another group that really struggled during the 1920s, and the government just kind of pretended wasn't a problem. The government tended to look the other way because Harding was perhaps a corrupt president. That seems very likely. And then he gets ill and dies, as you see in the president notes. And then Coolidge, never really said a whole lot and just kind of ignored that there was a problem going on. He was all about letting things kind of prosper on their own. And he was, just kind of letting Americans do their own things at home as well as abroad, right? As we had a very isolated kind of policy, refused to get involved in world affairs ever again. So farmers during World War I, they had taken out these loans so they could buy new John Deere tractors and all sorts of equipment because there was a need to produce as much food as we possibly could. We wanted to produce food, we wanted to ship it overseas, so not only the American soldiers, but the French, and all of our allies would have enough food during the war effort. The thought was the more food and guns and supplies that we had, that would win the war effort. Well, here's the problem. The war ends, we're still producing all this food, and these farmers really needed to cut back on production more so than they did. So the hope was that we could somehow still sell this food overseas, but the Europeans, now that the war is over, they really needed the food from us. It took them a long time to fill in those trenches in France and, have farmers grow food and go back to normal life, but they refused to really buy it from us. So our farmers were producing way too much. And, if you go to a farmer's market and I'm walking down and here's an organic potato and here's an organic potato, and back then they didn't label them as organic, they're just all potatoes. You've got red potatoes, right? And you've got russet potatoes and Idaho potatoes. Besides, there's some characteristics about where they're grown. It's a potato. It's the same thing. I'm not picky about potatoes. As long as they're fresh, they're not rotting, I want the cheapest one available. Honestly, I feel the same way about gas and some other products. Many Americans did as well. And so since there was so much of a supply, that means that the price drops. Some farmers are taking whatever prices they can to sell their food so that it doesn't go bad, because obviously if you don't sell it before it rots, you get nothing for it. And so they're not making enough money to basically pay the debts on their homes, on their farms, to pay the mortgages, to pay their loans from the banks for all this fancy equipment they bought, and now they're facing foreclosures. And this was impacting 25% of Americans. Now, the other issue that we see is lack of diversification in the economy. I know that's a mouthful. What that basically means is we had a problem. When you ask the average American, what do you do for a living? Most of them who had jobs, so we're really talking about men who are working, it's still a limited amount of women who are working. Middle class, upper class women did not work. We see a few middle class women who are perhaps professors, teachers, but that's very uncommon for women to go to college. We're starting to see kind of women break into that mold, but still pretty uncommon, honestly. And lower class women would work, but often in factory jobs. So we're really talking about men, and most of these men work in the construction industry or in the auto industry. Everything was related to cars. America was starting to get car crazy in the 20s. They will again in the 1950s. Henry Ford uses something called the assembly line method of production, where somebody does the same task over and over again. Instead of having one person trying to build a whole car, you have someone build a part of a car over and over again so that they can master it. They get faster at it. They can do it in their sleep. They know exactly looking at it how it's done or what's wrong with it. And so it helps produce cars a lot faster. And so it cuts down on costs. And he's able to sell the Model T and then later the Model A at a very affordable price. And so Henry Ford is able to, pay his employees a lot more money. We see that wages in the prior to the 1920s, prior to World War I, we still saw people making only $1, $1.50 a day. Once World War I hits, daily wages skyrocket. And then they're going to decrease a bit after World War I and then kind of level out again and then slowly kind of increase to the 20s. But Henry Ford was one of the first people to offer anyone $5 for a day to come and work for him. Perhaps stock in his company. There were all sorts of benefits to really working for this man. He treated his employees with respect, which was not very common, especially since, many factory owners still, did not like the idea of labor unions and felt that was something that was akin with communists or socialists and, violent strikers and things like that. So everybody had these jobs in the auto industry related to it. So, tires require rubber, windshields need to be made out of glass. So there were all sorts of other industries, in terms of gas stations and oil and repairing roads. All of these things created jobs for Americans as they became car crazy. And yet again, though, here's the problem. As people returned from war, They decide to buy a car, they've been putting it off, and now they choose to because they can buy it on credit. Debt is starting to become less shameful in America. You can buy now and pay later. You can buy it an installment plan. And so Americans are buying these cars, but yet again, you only need one car for your family. The idea of having two or three was just unheard of, especially since in most families only one person worked. If more than one person worked, they usually couldn't afford to buy a car anyway because they were poor and they would walk to work or rely on public transportation. So we're starting to see, overproduction. By the end of the 20s, we started to see that Henry Ford, and he's starting to have competitors at this point with GM and Chrysler, they had been selling a whole bunch of cars, but now they're starting to decline in the amount of cars they're sold and profits. First, they start to decrease people's salaries and then they start to have layoffs. So unemployment was already starting to rise before the crash. And it's not just like Henry Ford who's laying off people. Henry Ford isn't selling as many cars, which means that at the rubber factory, they don't need as many employees. At the glass factory, at all these other kinds of industries. So there is a domino or cyclical effect. Same thing in the construction industry. There was a boom after World War I where many people wanted to live the great American dream. They wanted to come home and, get married. They wanted to build a house or buy a house and get new furniture for it and decorate it and have a family and just do all these things. And remember, it's still a time period where even if your values do not kind of mesh with the mainstream America and you saying, well, I wouldn't want to get married, it's a very, biased kind of society. It is, and it was, unfortunately. But this was still a time period where many people who did not agree with those values and said, that's not what I want in my life. That's not what I believe. That's not who I am. Unfortunately, kind of had to still kind of go off into the sidelines at this time, unfortunately. We'll get to some more of like the sexual revolution, the gender revolution that's coming later. So at this point, though, we're starting to see layoffs. So there's already kind of cracks in our economy that show us that things are not as great as perhaps we're believing them to be. Now, something that also is happening during this time period is the US government thinks that they're smart, and they try, they really do, but they're not always, which is why it's important as us as Americans to pay attention to the news, even though it seems boring or depressing, and to pay attention to politicians and what they're doing and what laws they pass, and to stay active in the government so that eventually you can vote, you can run for office, you can try to make the world a better place. Because the people at this time were not the brightest. They were interested in protecting American businesses. So what they decided to do was they passed tariffs. A tariff is when you tax imported goods. So speaking of rubber, speaking of tires, if it costs $100 to buy a tire that's made in China, let's say for your car, and it costs $150 a tire to buy the tire that's produced in America, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, we're going to put a tariff or a tax on basically the Chinese tires. So now it costs $175 to buy that Chinese tire. The reason they do that is because it's protecting American businesses. Some Americans might say, no matter what, I'm buying the American-made product because I care about American businesses. Yes, that's wonderful. And that really, is a great value to have. However, many Americans who are lower middle class, who are lower class say, well, I'm struggling for money and I don't really care where it's made as long as it's good quality. I'm going to buy the foreign tire because that's all I can afford. So basically the government comes in, they put this tariff on there, which now means that the Chinese tire is $175, the American tire is $150. So by default, you are buying the American tire now instead. And so they are protecting American businesses. That's exactly what the government did in early 1920 when they passed the Ford-Lima-Cumber tariff. As we get to 1929 to 1930, they pass a later tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Sometimes it's also called the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And that actually increased tariffs by 20% than they had been in the past. And the thought process is, when you do this, it means that, Americans are buying more American-made goods rather than foreign-made goods, This is definitely true, and this is a good thing. But it also leads to an unequal balance of trade because we're not buying as much from Europe. The Europeans, or whoever we're in the trade relationship with, I chose China before, they get angry at us. And so they pass reciprocal tariffs on American goods coming into their country. So then they stop buying American-made goods as much. And so then you get into this trade war. So you really have to watch it because you want to have a favorable balance of trade where you're exporting, you're selling more goods than you're importing. But if you put up too many tariffs, it's a slippery slope, and then it's going to lead to problems. And since the 20s is a time period where most European countries have still not really kind of recovered from World War I, when we put up these tariffs, these taxes, and refuse to basically buy their products, it doesn't help them to recover at all, and it leaves them in kind of this economic recession. And of course, it makes it more possible for someone like Hitler to come to power in Germany when he promises jobs for those people. And it means that as we hit the Great Depression after the stock market crashes, European countries will also already be struggling and not in a position to help us. Next, what I talk about, I already kind of mentioned, it's this weak international economy. And the thought process is that it's all going back to the Treaty of Versailles. So, and there's 9 total, in case you're wondering. I know this is a long lecture today, guys. Sorry. So, when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles, remember that was the peace treaty that ended World War I that the United States never, ratified or approved because Senator Henry Cabot Lodge felt like it was unfair to Germany with War Guilt Clause 231, and it blamed Germany for all of World War I. It's they had to pay for the whole war. We never ratified it. We made our own separate treaty with Germany later. We never joined the League of Nations, which is all that President Wilson had cared about, that international peacekeeping group. So Germany was supposed to pay $33 billion for World War I. That's ridiculous. No country has that kind of money. They just don't. And so they try to repay France and Britain, and they end up struggling. It's really sad to watch. They just don't have the money to pay for the entire war. And so we end up coming up with something called the Dawes Plan in the 20s. Even though we claim we're isolated and we're staying out of foreign affairs, we do a couple of things in terms of world policy. We hold a Washington Naval Conference where we try to get all European powers and world powers to decrease the size of their navies. We never join the League of Nations. The US government doesn't kind of agree to that, but we create the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where we say that, all countries should support peace and we never should go to war. And we also create this Dawes Plan, where basically we loan money to Germany in this weird plan. We give the Germans money, they give the money to the British and the French to pay their war reparations for the Treaty of Versailles. Then the British and the French use that money to rebuild their country, but then they also repay us, Americans, the money that they borrowed from us during World War I, before we got involved. So we literally are getting repaid with our own money. It's kind of stupid. It's more important, though, because each country does keep some of the money. It puts some money back into circulation so they can rebuild roads because they were destroyed during the war, so they can put food on people's tables, so they can get people back to work. So it's a weird plan. It works a little bit, but those countries are still really struggling. They have high unemployment rates. They're definitely in a recession. We pass these high tariffs or taxes on them, and so we're not really buying a lot of their goods. And so what we see happen is when the stock market crashes, these countries are really kind of terrified because they realize they've already been struggling, and it's not like the Americans are going to come and bail them out or help them out in any way. Some of those European countries actually own stock in American businesses. So when our stock market crashes, it has a worldwide effect and they lose money as well. And it's also, since they're already struggling, why they're in the position where they can't help us to kind of recover from the stock market crash and from the depression that ensues. They can't give us any loans because they're already still kind of in this difficult position from World War I. Hopefully you guys are ready to move on at this point. And remember, feel free to write down as little or as much as you want. So we've got one more slide here. We'll see if we can get through it. If not, I might have to hit stop here. I don't want this to go too long. So the stock market crashes. And we said that when it comes to October of 1929, the stock market crashes. It starts crashing because we said that, people had really been overinflating the value of stocks. They were in this bidding war where they convinced themselves that this bull market, this stock market where the prices were going up, was going to continue forever. And that, a company like Black & Decker was doing better than it was, that it was selling more toasters than it was, that the price of the stock should continue to go up and up and up. They thought it would never go down. And so the prices of the stock were way too high. the company, they didn't reflect the company's true wealth or what the stock really should have been worth. So there's just too much inflation or high prices going on. And what we saw happen was that the Federal Reserve had increased interest rates. So if people had bought their stock on the margin and they were playing the stock market with borrowed money, which many people were doing, just like they were buying products on credit, they realized, oh my gosh, I thought I was going to make all this money, but now I'm going to have to pay back higher interest rates than I originally planned. So, thinking about it, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have the money that I thought. I'm just going to sell now, because what if the price of the stock would go down? They start to have all this anxiety and panic. And they say, I'm going to sell now. That way I can pay off my creditor, my banker, and I'll pay off the interest and plus the principal amount I borrowed, and I'll still have all of this money as I planned. But here's the problem. If everyone panics at the same time, it's pandemonium. In the stock market game you played, you didn't have to worry about finding a buyer. But in all reality, you can only sell a stock if someone is willing to buy it. Okay? If you've ever moved somewhere and your parents sold the house, you realize that you can't actually sell your house unless there's someone who's willing to buy it. Otherwise, it just sits on the market potentially for a long time. So people who were willing to buy, as the market started to crash here on Black Thursday, which all really started because of those rising interest rates, there were very few of them. And everybody else was like, what don't we know? Why is everybody selling? Are these companies doing bad? We need to get out now while we still have some money, and people are panicking. And a few people who were the buyers are like, well, I'm just going to buy now because this is the law of the market. The prices are dropping. Everybody's buying at the same time. And so if you've got 100 people who are willing to, yet again, sell you those potatoes, I'm going to, as a consumer, pay the cheapest price. So people started to sell their stock, perhaps at lower and lower and lower prices. Perhaps lower than they paid for that stock. They're taking huge hits, but they're afraid and they say it's better to get something than nothing. And so the few buyers out there were some, because they figured this is the law of the stock market. You buy when it's low, you sell when it's high. That's part of stock speculation and playing the market. And we know that during the next couple of days, the market continued to bottom out. And by Black Tuesday, we know that, millions of dollars have been lost. Some people committed suicide. Because they could not believe how much money they'd lost. It really affected the rich more so than the middle class or the poor. And things were out of control. And some people were lying and saying that they were, selling or buying stock, but really no one was. Everyone was selling. Now, in the days that follow, we start to see that there are runs on the bank, where basically what happens is that people say, oh my gosh, I just lost all this money on the stock market. I lost so much that I actually owe money now to the bank, because remember, they'd taken out a loan to play the stock market plus interest. Some of these people took out like thousands of dollars to play these loans because they just assumed that they'd make millions. So they don't have enough amount left even after selling their stocks. Now they have to go to the bank and they have to take out money to repay the banker. And if they don't have enough money in their bank account, their house is going to get sold, their car, whatever it may be, like that picture I showed you. And so there are runs on the bank. And the fear starts to, yet again, this is a lot of panic-based action. People are saying things like, hey, the bank doesn't have enough money. You need to get there now. Otherwise, you're never going to get the money in your savings account. And the reason this happened is because banks didn't used to keep all their money like in the back room. Many of them were savings and loans banks. So, they didn't really have that much cash on hand. And, a lot of the incoming cash relied upon somebody coming in and cashing their paycheck and putting it in their savings account. But 10 minutes later, somebody else comes in and they make a withdrawal. If everybody who banked at that institution came in at the same day, at the same time, and demanded all of their money out of their account, they physically don't have it all in the back room on hand. And that's exactly what happened, because yet again, it's panic. It's fear that somehow the banks are going to run out of money. And so if you watch the video clip I posted, it does a good job of showing that. We know that within just a few weeks and then into the upcoming months and years, more than 600 banks close across America. And this is a real problem because when these banks close, they never reopen. These people never get their money back. And so it could be like their entire life savings now gone forever. And so that means there's going to be less money in circulation. People aren't going to trust banks. There's going to be no confidence. And if that was all the money I had was in that bank, even if I don't play the stock market, even if I'm a normal American, all of a sudden I find out, hey, my boss is letting me go because my boss lost all of his money in the stock market. He's going to have to sell the company. And so he's decided to fire me in the process. So I go to the bank to take out money so I can feed my family and I can pay rent. Oh, wait a minute. I get to the bank's closed down, and there goes all of our savings. And I only have $20 in our apartment. And so very quickly, I can't pay the rent. Now my family is homeless. And so it's a reverberating effect, yet again, a domino effect. Now, the government could have stepped in at this point. There was something called the Federal Reserve. We have it today. It's a system of bankers' banks. The Federal Reserve could have stepped in and they could have said, hey, these banks can't close. We're going to give them a loan. Here's some money to stay open, which is what you see in the It's a Wonderful Life clip. Maybe you guys can't get all your money out of the bank right now, but here's $50 for each of you. Here's $100 for each of you. Come back tomorrow. We'll give you a little more money. The Federal Reserve, the government could have stepped in and done something to keep these banks open, to stop the run on the banks, but they didn't do anything. They didn't realize at this point in history that it was their job to help these banks and to protect them. The other problem is monetary policy. During this time period, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates high. So as people have no money, they could go to another bank and say, please give me a loan. I'm starving. I'm stranded on the street. The banks refused to do so. They refused to give loans to people, and they kept interest rates high, which meant that people weren't able to build a house, they weren't able to buy a car, they weren't able to really get by. And during this whole time period, President Hoover fails to do anything. He believes in laissez-faire capitalism, or let it be. Like other previous Republican presidents, he feels like it's not his job to intervene in the Depression. He says it's temporary. His Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, says it's going to come to an end, don't worry about it. And so unfortunately, as he does nothing, the suffering of the American people just continues. And over time, this gets worse and worse. All right, guys, I know that was a long one. Sorry, we had to kind of review a little bit. I know because earlier this week, things were just kind of off when I was sick. All right, that's it for now. Later.